A packed courtroom, camera crews from every major news network pointing toward the defendant's bench, a billionaire about to lose everything because his lawyer simply stood up and walked out in the middle of the trial. The silence was deafening. Everyone expected the collapse of the Montgomery empire, but then a soft voice cut through the air. A woman in a housekeeper's uniform stood up and spoke the words no one expected to hear. "I can defend him." What happened next changed not only that man's destiny, but exposed secrets that many powerful people wanted to keep buried. This is the incredible story of Sarah Mitchell, the housekeeper who became a courtroom legend. Sarah Mitchell woke at 5 a.m., as she did every day since she started working at the Montgomery mansion. It was her third day on the job, and she still hadn't gotten used to the grandeur of that house in Riverside Hills. 22 rooms, 6 bathrooms, an Olympic-sized pool, and gardens that seemed endless. While preparing breakfast, Sarah thought about how drastically her life had changed in the last 6 months. A law graduate from Boston University with a full scholarship, she had been her mother's pride, Dorothy, who had worked her entire life as a cleaner to ensure her daughter had opportunities she never had. But fate played a cruel trick. 3 months before Sarah was to take the bar exam, Dorothy suffered a massive stroke and passed away within 48 hours. With a 15-year-old brother to raise, bills to pay, and no financial reserve, Sarah had to postpone her dreams. The bar exam cost nearly $2,000, plus preparatory courses. She accepted the first job that came along. Ironically, the same type of work her mother had done, domestic housekeeper. At least the salary was enough to pay rent on the small apartment she shared with Tyler, her brother, and there was still a bit left over for him to continue his studies. At 7 a.m., Sarah went up to the second floor to clean Thomas Montgomery's office. She had only seen her employer twice, always in a hurry, always on the phone. A 52-year-old man with neatly trimmed grey hair, deep circles under his eyes, and the expression of someone carrying the world on his shoulders. The office was immense, an entire wall covered with books, a mahogany desk that must have cost more than a compact car, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. But what caught Sarah's attention was the mess. Documents scattered everywhere, open folders, sticky notes plastered on every possible surface. While carefully organizing the papers, trying not to disturb an order that apparently only made sense to Thomas, Sarah's eyes fixed on a header, Superior Court of Massachusetts, criminal case number 34568789. She couldn't help herself. Her years studying criminal law made her keep reading. It was an accusation of tax fraud and money laundering. The listed evidence seemed overwhelming. Transfers to offshore accounts, fake contracts, falsified documents. But something was wrong, Sarah noticed immediately. The dates didn't match. A contract supposedly signed by Thomas was dated March 15, 2023, but the notary stamp indicated March 18th. 3 days difference. She grabbed another document. More inconsistencies, signatures that looked slightly different, amounts that didn't correspond to the attached bank statements. "Find something interesting?" The deep voice made her jump. Thomas stood in the doorway, holding a coffee cup, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Montgomery, I was just organizing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he interrupted, entering the office and dropping into his chair. He looked exhausted. "Anyway, in 2 days, none of this will matter anymore. Either I'll be acquitted, or I'll be on my way to prison." Sarah remained silent, unsure what to say. Thomas didn't even seem to notice her presence anymore. He simply stared out the window, lost in thoughts that clearly tormented him. It was Monday, 9 a.m. Sarah was in the mansion's kitchen preparing lunch while the television broadcast live coverage of Thomas Montgomery's trial. All major news channels had interrupted their regular programming to cover the case that had become one of the most talked about in the country. The criminal courthouse was surrounded by dozens of journalists, photographers, and onlookers. Sarah saw Thomas getting out of a black car, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit, flanked by security guards and Dr. Victoria Sullivan, his lawyer. Victoria was 40 years old, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a red suit that conveyed power and confidence. She was nationally known for defending politicians, businessmen, and celebrities in impossible cases with an impressive win rate. Inside the courtroom, the session began. Judge Harold Foster, a 60-year-old man with a reputation for being strict but fair, started the proceedings. Prosecutor Marcus Reed stood to present the accusations. Tall, thin, with glasses and a stern expression, he had a reputation for never losing a case. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Marcus began with a firm, clear voice, "what we have here is not a simple accounting error or administrative confusion. We have a systematic and deliberate tax fraud scheme that diverted more than $50 million from public coffers over 5 years." Sarah stopped chopping vegetables, completely absorbed. Marcus presented a sequence of slides showing bank transfers, shell companies registered in tax havens, fraudulent contracts. Everything seemed meticulously documented. When it was the defense's turn, Victoria stood with rehearsed elegance. But Sarah frowned. Something was wrong. Victoria was using a generic, appealing, emotional defense. She wasn't refuting the specific evidence. She wasn't questioning the authenticity of the documents. She wasn't pointing out the same inconsistencies Sarah had noticed. "Why isn't she mentioning the wrong dates?" Sarah murmured to herself. "Why isn't she questioning the notary stamps?" The session continued until noon, when the judge decreed a 2-hour break. At 1:30 p.m., Thomas arrived home accompanied by his 2 children. Margaret Montgomery, 30, was an architect with short brown hair and penetrating green eyes. Robert, the younger son, 26, was chief administrator of the family businesses, tall, dark-haired, with an MBA from Harvard. They sat in the living room in heavy silence. Sarah served coffee and noticed the tension in the air. Margaret was nervously checking her phone. Robert stared at the wall. Thomas seemed years older. Then Thomas's phone rang. It was Victoria. Sarah couldn't help but overhear the conversation through the slightly open door. "I can't do this anymore, Thomas, I'm sorry." Victoria's voice sounded distant through the speaker. "I'm withdrawing from the case." "What?" "Victoria, the trial resumes in less than an hour." "I know, and I'm sorry, but I can't. Good luck." The line went dead. Thomas stood motionless, staring at his phone. Sarah's heart raced. She knew what this meant. Without a lawyer, Thomas would be convicted. All those inconsistencies she'd found would be ignored. An innocent man would go to prison while the real culprit walked free. She thought of her mother, Dorothy, who had always taught her, when you see an injustice and have the power to stop it, you must act. Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah walked into the living room. "Mr. Montgomery, I can defend you." Everyone turned to look at her. Margaret let out a nervous laugh. Robert frowned. Thomas looked confused. "Sarah, I appreciate the gesture, but I have a law degree from Boston University. I graduated top of my class. I know criminal law, and more importantly, I found evidence in your office that proves your innocence. Evidence your lawyer never mentioned." Thomas studied her face. "You're serious?" "Completely. Those documents, they're forged. The dates don't match. The signatures are inconsistent. The amounts don't correspond to the actual bank records. Someone set you up, and I can prove it." Robert stepped forward. "Dad, she doesn't even have a bar license. The judge will never allow it." "Actually," Sarah said, pulling her phone from her pocket. In Massachusetts, Rule 3.03 of the Rules of Professional Conduct allows a party to represent themselves or, with the court's permission, be represented by someone with sufficient legal knowledge in extraordinary circumstances. Thomas looked at his children, then back at Sarah. Time was running out. "Let's go," he said finally. "What do we have to lose?" At the courthouse, chaos reigned. News of Victoria Sullivan's dramatic exit had spread. Journalists swarmed, cameras flashed. When Thomas entered the courtroom with Sarah beside him, still in her housekeeper's uniform, the room erupted in whispers. Judge Foster banged his gavel. "Mr. Montgomery, where is your attorney?" "Your Honor, Dr. Sullivan has withdrawn from my case. I request permission to be represented by Miss Sarah Mitchell." The judge looked at Sarah with raised eyebrows. "Miss Mitchell, are you a licensed attorney?" "No, Your Honor, but I am a law graduate, and given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I invoke Rule 303 and request permission to represent Mr. Montgomery." Prosecutor Reed jumped up. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A housekeeper cannot—" "Actually," Sarah interrupted calmly, "it's not unprecedented. In Parker versus Commonwealth, a non-licensed law graduate was permitted to represent a defendant in extenuating circumstances." Judge Foster studied Sarah for a long moment. "Very well. But Miss Mitchell, this is highly irregular. I'll allow it, but you'll receive no special treatment. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, Your Honor. I don't want special treatment. I want justice." Sarah opened her first examination by calling Thomas to the stand. But instead of following a traditional defense strategy, she did something unexpected. "Mr. Montgomery, who has access to your company accounts and signing authority, my CFO, Richard Stevens. He's been with me for 15 years. He's like a brother to me." Sarah pulled out documents. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A, notarized contracts allegedly signed by Mr. Montgomery. Note the dates, March 15th, 2023, but the notary stamp shows March 18th, 3 days after Mr. Montgomery was documented being in London for a business conference. He couldn't have signed these documents." The courtroom stirred. Prosecutor Reed looked confused. Sarah continued. "Exhibit B, bank transfer records." She pulled out more documents. "It went to an account belonging to Richard Stevens, and here's the most damning evidence. Emails between Mr. Stevens and a computer forensics expert discussing how to forge digital signatures and backdate documents." Thomas looked shocked. "Richard? No, that's impossible." "Your Honor," Sarah said, "I move to call Richard Stevens as a witness." Richard, who had been sitting in the gallery supporting his friend, went pale. As officers approached him, he tried to flee, but was quickly apprehended. Under oath and confronted with undeniable evidence, Richard Stevens confessed. 15 years of resentment, of working in Thomas's shadow, of wanting the glory and wealth for himself. He had meticulously planned the frame-up for years. Judge Foster declared Thomas Montgomery innocent of all charges. Richard Stevens was arrested on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. The story of Sarah Mitchell became national news. The housekeeper who saved a billionaire. The attorney without a license who exposed a conspiracy. Interview requests, job offers, book deals poured in. But the offer that mattered came from Thomas. "Sarah, I'd like you to become chief legal consultant for Montgomery Corp. Annual salary of $300,000 to start. And I'll pay for the best bar prep courses. You deserve your license." Sarah accepted, thinking about how she could finally give Tyler a better life. 6 months later, she passed the bar exam with a perfect score. At the swearing-in ceremony, Thomas sat in the front row applauding. Margaret and Robert were there too, now true friends. And Tyler, her brother, now 16, stood beside her with tears of pride in his eyes. With her first paycheck, Sarah opened her own practice, Mitchell Law, Justice for All. She specialized in defending low-income people like her, whom the system had forgotten. 1 year later, a young 23-year-old housekeeper came to Sarah's office, unjustly accused of theft by her employer. The young woman had tears in her eyes. "I'm innocent, ma'am, but who will believe me?" Sarah smiled, remembering herself 1 year ago. "I will, and together we'll prove your innocence. Because justice isn't about how much money you have or what uniform you wear. It's about the truth, and the truth always wins."